Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So after some really positive feedback on my last few videos talking about mental health and my own personal journey with it, and really with the current global climate that gives way to rising mental illness rates, I wanted to continue these conversations by starting a new series, talking with experts and patients alike on various mental health topics. In this first conversation, I'm inviting one of my closest, most dearest childhood friends of mine and practicing psychologist, Dr. Maya Badwan of the Birch Psychology Clinic in Denver to talk about stigmas in our country around depression and anxiety and how they really affect us all. Maya, thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah, absolutely.
You are so impressive. You have been a psychologist to me really my whole life, I feel like. Maya, anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the US, affecting 40 million adults in the United States. And although they are highly treatable, only about 36.9% of those suffering actually receive treatment. Why do you think this is?
I think one of the biggest issues is probably access to services. Something that I hear day to day from people who are interested in therapy or kind of curious about starting the process is like, will my insurance cover this? And I'd say probably more than half of the people that I see don't currently have plans that cover therapy or only cover like 10 to 20% of the cost of therapy, which can be pretty high.
Do you see any changes in relation to our healthcare system and in relation to insurance policies beginning to treat mental illness as they would a physical illness?
I think it's starting to improve. Some plans are offering people like a certain reimbursement rate, but I think in general, the sort of approach to psychological treatment is that it's not the same as physical necessities. If you're talking about stigma, what message does that send if the insurance company is saying this isn't a necessary treatment? I don't think it's unreasonable that then people start to think, okay, well, maybe there's another thing I can do to handle this, or maybe I don't need to see a specialist to talk about what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I can even tell you from my personal experience, and this is something I talked about in one of my most recent videos. It was interesting because it truly was, and you know this because we've known each other forever, it was truly the first time I had so publicly talked about like, you know, my like eye tick and things like that, which even with you guys, even with some of my closest friends, it's like a weird thing for me to discuss so candidly. And I started thinking, I was like, okay, why is this so hard? Like I turned on the camera and I was sitting on my bed in my room. I was like, why is this such a difficult conversation for me to have? And I was like getting super emotional doing it, which I definitely did not foresee happening.
The first thing I'm thinking of is how vulnerable it is to share such a personal experience with even friends and family, like close friends and family, let alone for you. I mean, doing something so courageous and sharing that with your whole platform is amazing, but it's also a pretty vulnerable thing to do just in general. I mean, you're sharing something about your inner experience and you're not sure how the person sitting across from you is going to respond to that. On top of that, and you know, you've addressed this too, is that maybe we're used to or accustomed to people thinking that if you have anxiety, that's going to make you less capable of doing something, or you're going to be less able to complete the job or less able to be a good friend. And I don't think that that's true.
I think one of the other things that I was kind of struggling with is like, I am fully aware of my status as a privileged white person who maybe looks a certain way. Am I really able to share this? And will, you know, there be some sort of like backlash, or will people, you know, take it the wrong way, or will people even be offended by me coming forth and talking about it because of those certain attributes? And then I just kind of have to think like, and we've talked about this before offline, like depression and anxiety, it doesn't discriminate.
Some of the most ill people that I've treated are still able to do their day-to-day functioning and still might look like from the outside to others that they're doing okay. But that's not always the case. And depression can show up in all sorts of ways, both subtle and not so subtle. So I think it's a pretty dangerous thing to say you don't look depressed or you don't look anxious to somebody. I think that's like such an invalidating thing to say.
I wanted to ask you this, like why are our rates of mental illness increasing so heavily?
We're seeing higher rates of depression and anxiety in adults, and especially in young people, like 12 to 17 years old. Right now, we have the highest suicide rate since World War II. Some people suspect that digital media has something to do with it, especially for those like influxes in young people. How many hours are we spending in front of the screen, and how much is that preventing us from face-to-face interaction? It's kind of ironic, like in in a way, we are the most connected we've ever been. You can hop online and get an answer to any question you have, or connect with somebody halfway across the world, which is so cool. And also I'm seeing like the highest complaint that I see come through the door is like loneliness.
Yeah. So how can we stop it?
You know, I'm kind of thinking about how do you change a problem that you don't acknowledge exists from the get-go. So looking out for common signs of depression and anxiety. Are you having less energy than you've had? Are you eating more or less? Is your sleeping off? Do you feel more irritable? Is your mood lower than it usually is? I think for a lot of people, some of the most difficult parts of starting treatment is even acknowledging that you need it.
You know, your brain is just an organ, much like any other body part. Like you know, if somebody breaks their arm, you're not gonna say, oh, you're just faking that, or you'll be fine, you'll get over it, you're just being a wussy. Like you don't do that. But your brain is also, it's a part of the body that also needs treated. So I'm trying to consider it as like people who actually go and seek help. They're the brave ones. Like they're the ones that took that next step to acknowledge, like, okay, I have this problem, and now I'm proactive enough to go to fix it. A vast majority of my audience, I would say, is male. So just kind of wanted to have a conversation about how gender, you know, takes part in this whole conversation around stigmas as it relates to mental health.
Men are far less likely to seek treatment. They're also 3 times more likely to commit suicide than women. I think about sort of like our nation's socialization towards men, and nobody is not familiar with the idea of toxic masculinity at this point. And like, what do we tell our boys from the moment that they're little boys, right? Like, you're a man, tough it out. People were sort of pointing to the connection of like old Westerns. I don't know if you've seen any old Western movies.
Yeah.
And using that sort of as a marker of like our cultural evolution around how we treat men in psychology, and how like the noble thing to do if you're like a prisoner of war or if you're suffering is to just take your own life by your own hand. Really sort of sending the message that there's like a nobility around not suffering. I'm not going to suffer. I'm not going to ask for help. I'm just going to.
I'd rather take my own life and end it on my own accord than have someone.
Right. Almost like it's been like romanticized.
It's interesting that you bring up toxic masculinity, because this is something, you know, being a gay male, this is a pretty prevalent topic of conversation nowadays, because it certainly carries over even into the gay community. There's so much toxic masculinity and so much shame. It's, you know, like femme shaming. Like if you're a bit too feminine presenting, right? There's a stigma around that as well. What has your experience been like, specifically being first generation, Middle Eastern specifically, and how that relates to mental health and how that's kind of considered and treated within your culture as compared to American culture?
But I think a lot of it has to do with cultural norms, right? So like in the Middle East, it's more of a collectivist culture. It's almost frowned upon that you would leave your family unit, your support unit, your community to go talk to a stranger about what's going on.
In Buenos Aires, in Argentina, there are more psychologists per capita than anywhere else in the world. And it was a culture where it was so normalized to leave work, you know, 10, 11 a.m. every week and go talk to your therapist.
I mean, I think of what message that's sending to people. Like, we as a government and as a nation respect and think that your psychological experience is valid and worth supporting. Whether that's, you know, we allow you to leave work at 11 a.m. because that's your therapy hour, great, no questions asked, or maybe part of the insurance plan is that they support their citizens in doing that. But I think for us to get to that stage, we need to lead by example, and our government needs to take a step like that and saying, yeah, this is a valid thing that we're going to help and encourage our citizens to get care for and support around, but we're just not there yet.
What would you say to somebody rather who's considering going to see a psychologist, but they're not quite yet sure?
I would say go for it. And I think people get a little bit nervous that, you know, if they call that person, that's it, they're stuck with them, you know, they're rolling down the roller coaster that maybe they're not totally prepared for. But just like choosing any provider, you get the chance to interview them. So I have a lot of people that come through and we just, you know, set up sort of a 15 to 20 minute consultation. They tell me a little bit about what's going on. They get a sense for me, I get a sense for them. And you don't have to make a decision at that point. You can talk to 3 other therapists and see if, you know, you found a good fit.
I mean, it's kind of amazing. Like, you literally get to go and have someone listen to you talk for an hour. Like, that is like that's your job. Like, that is it's awesome. And I think it's very cathartic for people to have an objective viewpoint.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on the money of how therapy works, right? It's not our jobs to tell people what to do or what not to do, but to hold really difficult feelings sometimes, and also maybe reflect back to them patterns, or, hey, I noticed that last time you came in, you were talking about something similar. It seems like it's a big deal for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think zooming out, one of the most important things about therapy is feeling connected and feeling understood by somebody, and that somebody has created the space for you an hour a week for you to go and feel that sense of connection. And that it's somebody who's not so biased, maybe like having a friend. I mean, it's great to talk to your friends, like you've said, and family, and I continue to encourage people to do that. But there's also something unique about talking to somebody who's hopefully pretty removed from that.
Let me ask you this kind of as a final wrap-up question. Like, how can we break, I guess, both the stigma around going to see a therapist, right, which is what we're just talking about, but also just the stigma around depression and anxiety in general? Like, what are some things that we can do as a society in our everyday lives and our everyday actions to break those stigmas?
I think you're leading by example with just starting the conversation. So doing things like this, having conversations with people who are experiencing mental health issues, or who work with people experiencing mental health issues, I think starts to normalize these conversations. You getting up in front of a big platform and saying, hey, anxiety is something that I struggle with, is normalizing that experience for so many people. I'm seeing this a lot because of my newly found interest in TikTok. I'm seeing this so much amongst Gen Z.
All of our newly found interests.
Yes, I know. I tried to fight it, but it's not worth it anymore. I'm seeing so much of Gen Z, like just being really open about mental health issues and therapy. And it's so refreshing. And I think that that's really cool that they're also sort of a big push for normalizing this thing. And hearing people casually say, I talked to my therapist, or making it a meme or a joke of like, conversation between me and my therapist, and it's still lighthearted and funny for social media, but also normalizing that people go to therapy. Regular, normal people who are functioning and going to work and have jobs are going to therapy for support, and it's totally normal and okay.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Maya, for joining us today, and thank you for chatting with us about this very serious topic, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I love you.
I love you too, and I'm so proud of what you're doing, and I think this is awesome. You really are leading by example, and me and all of us from home are so proud of you.
Girlfriend, you're like out in like the field doing the day-to-day hard work. This is just a video. Thank you.
Don't need it.
All right, mwah, love you.
Love you.